Okay, hi. So before we go over those tests, the Zoomer test, I thought it would be a good idea to create this video so you have a better general understanding of the overall view of the digestive system and what we are trying to talk about. So we don't have to keep repeating, because I know we do have to go over multiple tests. And so this could be just a good reference for you to watch before we actually go over the test. So things kind of will make a little more sense. And if you've seen any of this before, just pardon me. I think it'll just be a good refresher. Okay. So having said that, I am going to start sharing my screen so we can start to go over stuff. And I am going to stop my video so I can pay more attention to the slide. Okay, so when we talk about digestive system, basically what we are talking about is that mucosal barrier is this anatomy and physiology that we're talking about, all the way from mouth down to the esophagus, to stomach, to small intestine, large intestine, and then all the way to out, excreted in the feces. So this is basically an intestinal mucosal barrier. What I really want to focus on is the small intestine, but just to give you a general overview of everything, once we ingest food, it goes in our oral cavity in your mouth. And with the help of our enzymes, I mean, it really, digestion really starts when we start to smell the food, when we are cooking, when we're done cooking, we are smelling things. When we are more relaxed, all those digestive enzymes start to produce in our body. But most importantly, it starts producing in our mouth. Because sometimes, do you realize that when you start to smell some food or see some food, you start to salivate in your mouth already, and it makes you want to eat that food and be more hungry. So once we start chewing properly, that phase of digestion through the help of our esophagus goes down to our stomach. And the stomach is what has our stomach acid. And to contrary to what people believe, that higher stomach acid gives you gas and bloating and all, you do need the stomach acid to digest the big particles of protein that we eat. And along with that, we also make some intrinsic factors that helps to absorb our iron and B12, and all this happens in stomach. We just don't realize that this is a necessary process, that when we don't have enough iron and B12, we really have to consider looking at a stomach acid. But other than that, our main point is the stomach acid. If you don't have enough stomach acid, your food is just going to sit there and start to cause to go upwards and cause the other symptoms of gas, bloating, and other things that come along with that. So when we eat food, once it goes in the stomach, now this is our liver. So the liver makes the bile, along with regulating blood sugar and so much more. Liver just plays such a crucial role. It makes bile, and the bile is then stored in gallbladder. This is a little part, is called the gallbladder. It's on the right side below our middle of the rib cage. And as the gallbladder and the pancreas right here, right behind the stomach, they both, gallbladder is going to release bile, and then the pancreas is going to release the pancreatic enzymes into this area right here, duodenum. And that's where, with the help of stomach acid, the bile, and the pancreatic enzyme, most of our digestion is going to take place in the small intestine. And today I am really just focusing on this small intestine part. So that's where a majority of our digestion takes place. So that small intestine is our mucosal barrier. It's an inside out barrier. And that is the organ that's located between stomach and large intestine. And this is our large intestine, where the unwanted stuff comes out. Okay, and so this is where 90% of our nutrient absorption and breakdown takes place. So it really does play an important role in the body. So the main molecules that are absorbed in the small intestine are amino acids that come from protein, fatty acids that come from lipids or fats, simple sugars that come from our starches, carbohydrates, the simple and complex carbohydrates, and our vitamins and minerals. So this is the job of small intestine. So what happens if this mucosal barrier is not functioning well? When there is a disruption here, when there's a disruption here, the capacity to absorb the nutrient is compromised. Also, we have increased level of toxicity in the body. So do you see this image of anatomy? Looking at the basic anatomy of mucosal barrier. Let me just add another slide to it so we can see that better. Okay, so looking at the basic anatomy of the mucosal barrier, what we see is a, there goes my cursor. Oh, here we go. So there's a single cell lining, and these are called the enterocytes. And they are held together by tight junctions. Tight junctions here, 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 like that. They are stuck together. And then there is a finger-like projection right here, and they are called villi. And then there are microvilli. They are like small, tiny tentacles. And so this barrier functions in two ways. There is a physical barrier between the environment and us, and this barrier runs from mouth all the way down to the anus, and it's an inside-out barrier. Excuse me. So when you're exposed to everything that comes into this system, for example, food, drink, pathogen, bacteria, viruses, that goes down through this digestive system. So pretty much it protects our bodies from any pathogen coming into our bloodstream. Also, there is a chemical barrier. This is where 90% of the nutrient absorption and breakdown takes place, and further breaking them down into macronutrients, like our carbs, proteins, and fats, into small enough particle so they can be absorbed through this villi, microvilli, those finger-like projections. So there should be nothing coming through the barrier that's not broken down into small particle in general. And if there's anything larger, it can't get through because it has to be small enough to be absorbed. Okay. There are enzymes that help to break down these nutrients and transport them into the bloodstream. So this is how the mucosal barrier is supposed to work. There is also something called a secretory IgA. It's also a mucosal barrier, and that is this blue mucus layer. It's actually not blue in the body, but for our sake of our visuals, this is what the mucus layer is supposed to be like. And that also helps to protect us from unnecessarily going any unwanted pathogens from passing through the barrier. So it's a chemical defense barrier for us, like hydrochloric acid in the stomach that kills the pathogen. Secretory IgA, this layer, does the same thing. It's a chemical defense for a barrier. It's the chemical defense that protects against things that are not supposed to go through the system. And even though there's a physical barrier defense, we need this chemical barrier defense to make sure that nothing goes through this bloodstream. So now I'm going to show you a picture of the leaky gut on the right side. So there are several things that can disrupt this barrier, things that would make, that would go haywire and make the gut not function properly. You can have blood sugar issues, infections, use of any antibiotics, pharmaceutical drug, food sensitivity, not having enough stomach acid in the stomach, not having enough enzymes, entogenic proteins of any foods that you may be sensitive to. All these things will trigger and cause a disruption in the mucosal barrier and eventually cause damage and inflammation. So this is what the damage looks like on the right side. Do you see the space, open space between the enterocytes, the single cell layer? Right here, the space is starting to open up. When things start to break down consistently, you see these little holes in this mucosal barrier and the inflammation. Then things start to pass through into the bloodstream that are not supposed to go. So the larger proteins goes through the tight junctions, not broken down into small parts, and they go into the bloodstream. So when this happens, the immune system becomes hyperactive, and things are starting to get through that are not supposed to go through and create an immune response. Now, if it's a larger protein, food protein, your immune system might react by creating more antibodies. For example, peaches or plums, when they don't get broken down properly and they go through the bloodstream and in your immune system tags it, the next time you eat those fruit, they will cause inflammation in the body because the immune system will recognize them as a foreign and sees it as a threat. So you can get increased food sensitivities because things are leaking through the barrier and into the bloodstream before being broken down. Okay, so now let's talk about the villi and the microvilli. That little finger-like projection up top of the cell. There we go. This little things right here. You see, they are responsible for nutrient absorption. And due to inflammation and from all these triggers, they start to get damaged. How they are nice and good size, and they start to get blunted, they get damaged, and they actually shrink also. And well, we actually call them blunted brush border. And their job is supposed to wiggle out and catch nutrient, and they also make some enzymes. So when they when they shrink and then they get flat, it causes further damage. And when this happens, you don't have that enough surface area needed to properly absorb all the nutrient. So even when you're eating a healthy diet, your small intestine is just not absorbing it efficiently because it doesn't have that surface area to do its job well. Then this is when you can have nutrient deficiencies, vitamin and mineral deficiency, because so much of these vitamins and minerals are absorbed in the small intestine. Also, you have a significant amount of nutrient deficiency that can lead to symptoms like fatigue. You can have joint pain, migraines, anything you can think of, depression, anxiety, skin disorders, eczema, psoriasis, anything comes up. Then if this goes on for a long period of time, your body will start to attack itself And we call that autoimmunity because once your body cannot differentiate between what is really its own tissue and what is a foreign tissue. So it's like a war on creating autoimmune issues, muscle ache, pains, migraines, skin problems, and so much more. And your immune system becomes overly sensitive and hyperactive. It starts to overcompensate, and it will have a harder time differentiating between your own tissue and what's coming from outside. And this is why it's important for us to take a look at a digestive system as your main complaints reside in the digestive issues with cramps, bloating, gas, and so many things that we've been talking about. And with autoimmunity, once we're diagnosed with one autoimmune disease, it's just likely to pile on with other kind of autoimmune diseases. For example, once we have Hashimoto's thyroiditis, we can also have rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, and there are so many different kinds of autoimmune diseases. And this is why it's important for us to look at this digestive system. So all these things highly correlate with gut health. And so if you have a decreased nutrient absorption, you can have fatigue. If you have a increased permeability in the gut lining, like we just looked at, what we call leaky gut, and things in the tight junctions are passing through, then you can have increased toxic burden into your system. And you can have a digestive issues, sleep issues. And this is one reason why we do this food sensitivity test. When we have a dysfunction in the gut, when we have a gut barrier that is compromised, the food proteins are seen as antigens, and that's just the way it is. Our immune system is attacked, and it shows as an inflammatory response, and is there to fight off infection. But when the inflammation is excessive, we end up with food sensitivities. So you could be eating the healthiest foods and it could still be causing you inflammation. Food sensitivities can be half hour, 3 hours to up to 72 hours. For instance, for me, it was a lettuce. That came up as an inflammatory food for me, which I ate for a long time. I ate it all the time, I guess 4 or 5 times a week. I didn't feel any side effects from it, but it did cause me inflammation. And I don't necessarily have to have symptoms when I ate, but I still had that inflammation going. So it is really important for us to identify those inflammatory foods so we can eliminate those things from our diet and stop putting the fuel on the fire. And food that causes inflammation in the gut is going to create an environment right for hyperpermeability. And this is a perfect example of how our pathogens take place in our body. So we don't really know if it's the pathogens that create the leaky gut or if the food sensitivity that's creating leaky gut, but we do know that overall toxic burden in our body is going to cause that leaky gut. And further, we are not talking about it right now, but further, I can show you how having a leaky gut also compromises our liver function and how it affects our detoxification capacity. Okay. All right. So I would like to share another picture. If I find it. Okay. So for the sake of our conversation today, our job was to talk about leaky gut, what it is, and I think we described that in detail. The symptoms we talked about: depression, anxiety, migraine, headaches, muscle ache, chronic fatigue, brain fog, nutrient deficiencies, and all the autoimmune disease that are associated with that. Didn't really talk about asthma, but asthma is highly up there. So when you have leaky gut, it can be from alcohol, dairy, gluten, starches, sugar, antibiotics, anti-inflammatory drugs, excessive stress. Now, stress could be external as well. We could have emotional stress, mental stress, spiritual stress, job stress, financial stress, relationship stress. So everything has to be looked at. Also, certain conditions that relate to this gut condition is something we will need to address later, is when you have something called a leaky gut, what happens is our natural microbiome, our natural habitat of our organisms, we have more than 3 billion of them residing in our gut. They get imbalanced, and when they get imbalanced between good and bad bacteria, we call that dysbiosis. And that when that happens, we can also have a small intestinal bacterial overgrowth called SIBO. Also yeast, any kind of candida overgrowth, parasites. Even when you have low stomach acid, we can have something called H. pylori. That's another infection we can have in the stomach that leads to ulcer. So all these kind of things can be interconnected. So we are looking at food sensitivity today. And we talked about how the tight junctions are supposed to work. And then the villi we talked about. So one thing that I didn't talk about was other than the pathogens and the chemicals and the food sensitivities, whenever we have a leaky gut, all those gram-negative bacteria that are not supposed to pass through the digestive system and into the bloodstream, all this, the bacteria, undesired bacteria, and their exudates, what we call the little fragments of the bacteria, is what's called a lipopolysaccharide. And these are actually the cells of the bacteria that also passes through. And so the test zoomer that we're talking about, I want to focus on 3 things. First, I want to talk about lipopolysaccharides. And these are the little particles of the unwanted bacteria that passes through, and it causes antibody against it. So when we have this, it's a very big concern that we need to address. The other thing that I'd like to briefly mention is actin and zonulin. So zonulin is like a gatekeeper. So it's supposed to keep the tight junctions tight so it doesn't open up. And another thing I'd like to talk about is actin, and that's actually like the muscle that also helps to keep them junctions together, and it holds the villi and microvilli together. So anytime on the test, if you see any antibodies created from zonulin, actin, and lipopolysaccharides, it's something we really have to look at it from a point of view where we may need to have to do a further intervention. Because for one thing, avoiding the food that we're sensitive to is going to stop putting the fuel on the fire. But there are other things that are taking place, and we need to address them as well. So the gut infections is what I'm talking about. Healing and sealing the leaky gut is something that I'm talking about. Supplementation may be necessary based on if there are any deficiencies going on in the body that are correlating with whatever symptoms you may be having. Okay, so I'll put I'll just put that on standby, and then we'll talk about that test briefly because I do want to physically show you the results. But the Zoomer test is conventionally it was designed to diagnose a traditional celiac panel. It diagnosed for traditional celiac panel for false positives. So the Zoomer is a 99%, has a 99% sensitivity and 100% specificity. It measures the gluten, the non-gluten aspect of wheat, is the earliest detection for celiac disease. It's tested for cooked and raw food, and it tests even the smallest peptides of the protein. So proteins are primary triggers of that immune system. So when we look at the peptide sensitivity, it's way much better than the whole food sensitivity, and that's why we do this test. And a celiac disease is an autoimmune disease triggered by gluten and in the digestive system tract. And wheat sensitivity can be affected with celiac disease and even non-celiac disease, gluten sensitivity, or even a gluten intolerance. So the test looks at IgA and IgG. So I first want to talk about IgA. So IgA is primarily in the epithelial cells, the lining of your nose, your lungs, your blood-brain barrier, your digestive tract. And that's our primary defense. And there's about 70% of that resides in our gut, your GI tract. And it forms earlier than IgG. So the half-life of IgA is 3 to 6 days. Now, they're the first responders. So they are first to come and first to leave when it comes to responding. And it doesn't really correlate with the secretory IgA that I was talking about earlier in the picture. Now let's talk about IgG. So unlike IgA, IgG is more found in your blood and in your body fluids. And there's numerous of it. So it's not a system, not a specific location, not a location specific, but it's more systemic. It's everywhere in the body. The half-life of IgG is 28 to 96 days. So this is a very good indication of leakiness going into the bloodstream that we talked about. If we look at IgG and IgA together, it gives us an accurate diagnostic tool to see if it's crossing the blood-brain barrier and it's causing any systemic inflammation. Now, if you have a true food allergy, that will be measured with IgE, and that is like an immediate reaction, anaphylaxis kind of reaction, and that can have a half-life of 2 to 3 days, but that is immediate. So if you don't have that immediate reaction, it's IgA or IgG. Now that is what we are looking for long-term health. Okay, so the reference range for the sake of this test for IgA and IgG is, for IgA is 100 to 356, and for IgG is 1042 to 1590. Okay, so elevated zonulin levels, when you have elevated level of zonulin, it actually indicates exposure to gluten, any kind of gram-negative bacteria, any lipopolysaccharide that we talked about, And this is highly likelihood of a leaky gut. That's what zonulin means, because it is the gatekeeper of keeping those cells together. So when you have antibodies to anti-zonulin, that actually means that there's an indication that there's a leakage going through those tight junction and the lipopolysaccharides. So this is actually an immune response because it's creating an antibody. Now, the zonulin, the actin, when we make elevated antibodies to actin antibody, it is indicating there is a leakage through a tight junction and into the cellular structure. So there's a damage to the cell, and the villi and microvilli we talked about. There's so much of the atrophy going on that there's not enough surface area to absorb the nutrients. Okay, and I want to say that there could be wheat germ agglutinin reaction. So we could also have a reaction to the lectin part of the wheat. And this is the primary reason why people could have a low vitamin D level, because it can decrease your vitamin D levels because we're not able to absorb. And then it also mimics our insulin. So it's our fat storage hormone, and it can look like insulin pretty much. And I know we did a lot of different Zoomers, the celiac panel. I think the rest I'd like to discuss when we go over the test and see what is going on in the body. But I think you get the point. So I look forward to going over the test soon. Yeah. Okay, so we're going to stop here, and then when we individually go over the test, we'll have more insights into what's actually going on in our bodies individually. So I hope you find this helpful, and after you watch this video, we'll go over those tests, and can't wait to go with them. Okay, bye for now.